They stood side by side, dressed in black. Not in grief, but in relief. The wife was dead, or so everyone believed. The husband held his mistress's hand tightly, his lips trembling, not from sorrow, but from victory. And just as the final prayer was about to begin, a doctor stepped into the room and whispered words that froze every soul in place: "Stop everything. The boss is alive." What you're about to hear is a story of betrayal so deep it cuts to the bone, of love twisted into something unrecognizable, and of a woman who discovered the truth about the people she trusted most only when they thought she could no longer hear them. Stay with me, because what happened next destroyed lies, exposed betrayal, and proved that some people only reveal their true hearts when they think no one is watching. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. And also drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Are you in New York, US, South Africa, London, Manila? We want to know who's part of this community. Now, let's get into how this all began. Her name was Margaret Hale. For 32 years, Margaret was known as the Strong One. The woman who built her husband's company from a folding table and borrowed hope. The woman who skipped vacations so payroll would clear. The woman who believed loyalty was sacred. Her husband, Richard Hale, was charming, polished, respected, admired. People called him a self-made man. But the truth was quieter. Behind every contract Richard signed, Margaret had already sacrificed something. She loved him deeply, trusted him completely, and never imagined that betrayal could wear such a familiar face. Margaret came from humble beginnings. She grew up in a small town in Ohio, the daughter of a factory worker and a schoolteacher. Money was always tight, but her parents taught her the value of hard work, integrity, and standing by the people you love. She was the first in her family to go to college, working 3 jobs to pay her tuition. She studied business administration, dreaming of one day running her own company, of creating something meaningful that would last beyond her lifetime. That's where she met Richard. He was a year ahead of her, studying economics, and he had a way of talking about the future that made it seem not just possible, but inevitable. He spoke of empires built from nothing, of legacy and ambition, of changing the world one strategic move at a time. Margaret fell in love with his vision before she fell in love with him. But soon, the two became inseparable. Richard was magnetic. He could walk into a room and command attention without raising his voice. He made people believe in him, believe in his dreams, believe that following him was the smartest decision they could make. And Margaret believed too. She believed so completely that when Richard proposed to her 3 months before graduation, she didn't hesitate. She said yes with her whole heart, convinced that they would build something beautiful together. And for a while, they did. After graduation, Richard struggled to find his footing. He had big ideas but no capital, no connections, no clear path forward. He bounced from job to job, each one ending in frustration or disappointment. He wasn't good at taking orders. He wasn't built to work for someone else. He needed to be in charge, needed to call the shots, needed to see his name on something that mattered. But that required money, resources, and time, none of which they had. Margaret, on the other hand, found steady work almost immediately. She was hired as an operations manager at a mid-sized logistics company, and within 2 years, she had streamlined their entire supply chain, saving them hundreds of thousands of dollars. Her bosses loved her. Her colleagues respected her. But Margaret didn't want to spend her life making other people rich. So she made a decision. She took her savings, every penny she had earned, and handed it to Richard. She told him to start the company he had always dreamed of. She told him she believed in him. And she meant it. Richard was hesitant at first. He knew how hard she had worked for that money, knew what it represented. But Margaret insisted. She said they were a team, and that meant investing in each other's dreams. So Richard took the money, rented a small office space, and launched Hale Enterprises. It was supposed to be a consulting firm, helping small businesses optimize their operations and increase profitability. Richard handled the sales and client relations. Margaret handled everything else. And everything else was a lot. She managed the finances, the schedules, the contracts, the hiring, the logistics, the marketing, the administrative tasks, the day-to-day operations that kept the business running. She worked 16-hour days, often coming home long after Richard had gone to bed. She missed family gatherings, skipped holidays, postponed plans, all so the company could survive those critical early years. And it paid off. Within 5 years, Hale Enterprises had grown from a one-room operation to a respected firm with major clients and a growing reputation. Within 10 years, they had expanded to 3 cities and employed over 50 people. And Richard, charming, confident Richard, became the face of it all. He gave the speeches. He closed the deals. He shook the hands and smiled for the cameras. And people loved him. They called him visionary. They called him a genius. They called him a self-made man. And Richard never corrected them. He never mentioned the woman who had given him the seed money. He never talked about the countless nights Margaret spent balancing books and putting out fires while he entertained clients at expensive restaurants. He never credited her publicly for the systems she had built, the efficiencies she had created, the foundation she had laid. In private, he thanked her. He told her she was invaluable. But in public, the story was always about him. Margaret didn't mind at first. She wasn't the type to seek recognition. She was happy to work behind the scenes, happy to know that she was contributing to something bigger than herself. But over time, something shifted. Richard started coming home later. He started traveling more. He started missing dinners, forgetting anniversaries, brushing off her attempts at conversation. When she asked if everything was okay, he told her he was stressed, told her the business was demanding, told her she wouldn't understand because she wasn't the one dealing with clients and investors. And Margaret, ever patient, ever understanding, accepted that explanation. Then came Elaine. She was hired as Richard's executive assistant 3 years ago. Young, polished, efficient, and beautiful. Margaret met her once at a company holiday party. Elaine was charming, professional, complimentary. She told Margaret how much Richard spoke about her, how much he admired her work ethic, how lucky he was to have her. Margaret smiled and thanked her, feeling a strange unease she couldn't quite name. But she pushed it aside. She told herself she was being paranoid, that she had no reason to suspect anything. After all, Richard had always been faithful. He had always been devoted. Or so she thought. But things continued to change. Richard became distant. Cold. When Margaret reached for his hand, he pulled away. When she tried to talk about the business, he shut her down. When she suggested they take a vacation, he told her it was impossible, that he had too many responsibilities, that she was being selfish. And slowly, painfully, Margaret began to realize that the man she had built a life with was slipping away. She noticed the late-night phone calls he took in another room. She noticed the way he smiled at his phone when he thought she wasn't looking. She noticed the new cologne, the nicer clothes, the sudden interest in his appearance. And she noticed Elaine. Always there. Always available. Always just a little too close. Margaret tried to confront Richard once. She asked him directly if something was going on. He laughed. He told her she was being ridiculous, that Elaine was just an employee, that Margaret was letting her insecurities get the best of her. He made her feel foolish for even asking. So she stopped asking. She buried her suspicions and told herself that love meant trust, that marriage meant giving your partner the benefit of the doubt. But deep down, she knew. She knew something was broken. She just didn't know how badly. One rainy evening in late October, Margaret was working late at the office. Most of the staff had gone home, but she was trying to finalize a contract that needed to be submitted by morning. She had been feeling off all day, a strange tightness in her chest, a heaviness that wouldn't go away. She ignored it. She had work to do. But around 8 o'clock, the tightness became pain. Sharp, radiating pain that spread through her chest and down her left arm. She gasped, gripping the edge of her desk. She tried to stand, but her legs gave out. She collapsed onto the floor, her vision blurring, her breath coming in short, desperate gasps. Someone found her. One of the cleaning staff, a woman named Rosa, heard the thud and came running. She called 911 immediately. Paramedics arrived within minutes. They worked quickly, loading Margaret onto a stretcher, hooking her up to monitors, asking her questions she couldn't answer. The pain was overwhelming. She felt like her chest was being crushed. She heard the paramedics talking, heard words like cardiac episode and critical condition, but it all felt distant, like she was listening from underwater. They rushed her to the hospital, sirens wailing through the rain-soaked streets. The hospital called Richard. He was listed as her emergency contact. He answered on the third ring. The nurse explained the situation, told him his wife had suffered a severe cardiac episode and was being rushed into emergency care. Richard asked if it was serious. The nurse said yes, very serious. Richard said he would be there as soon as he could. But he didn't rush. He didn't panic. He finished the conversation he was having first. Then he got in his car and drove to the hospital at a normal speed, following every traffic law, taking his time. When he arrived, the doctors met him in the waiting room. They explained that Margaret's heart had stopped twice in the ambulance. They had managed to revive her both times, but her condition was unstable. They weren't sure if she would make it through the night. They asked if he wanted to see her. Richard nodded. They led him to the ICU, to a small room filled with machines and monitors. Margaret lay in the bed, pale and still, a breathing tube down her throat, wires running from her body to various devices. Richard stood at the doorway for a moment, staring at her. Then he stepped inside, walked to the edge of the bed, and looked down at his wife of 32 years. And he felt nothing. No fear. No sadness. No panic. Just a strange, hollow relief. Because if she died tonight, everything would be simpler. He wouldn't have to explain. Wouldn't have to confess. Wouldn't have to face the consequences of what he had been doing. He could grieve publicly, accept condolences, and move on with his life. With Elaine. The thought settled over him like a blanket, warm and comforting. He stood there for another minute, then turned and walked out. That night, something darker happened. Elaine arrived at the hospital too. Richard had texted her, told her what was happening. She came not to pray, not to hope, but to wait. She found Richard in the waiting room, sitting alone, staring at the floor. She sat down next to him, placed her hand on his knee. They didn't say much. They didn't need to. They both knew what they were waiting for. They both knew what would happen if Margaret didn't wake up. And when a nurse came out an hour later and told them that Margaret's heart had flatlined for a full 60 seconds, Richard exhaled. Because he believed it was over. But it wasn't. A senior doctor, a cardiologist named Dr. Samuel Pierce, was on duty that night. He was experienced, thorough, and deeply skeptical of easy conclusions. When Margaret's heart stopped, the team followed protocol, attempting resuscitation, shocking her chest, administering medication. And after 60 seconds, her heart started again. Weak, irregular, but beating. Most doctors would have marked it as a successful resuscitation and moved on. But Dr. Pierce noticed something. A faint neurological response. A slight twitch in her fingers. A flicker of brain activity on the monitor. It was subtle, barely there, but it was enough to make him pause. He ordered more tests. He ran an EEG, monitored her brain waves, checked her reflexes. And what he found shocked him. Margaret was not brain dead. She was not in a coma. She was in a state called locked-in syndrome. Her body was unresponsive, her muscles paralyzed, but her mind was fully awake. She could hear. She could think. She could understand everything happening around her. But she couldn't move. Couldn't speak. Couldn't signal that she was still there. To everyone else, she appeared dead. But inside, Margaret was very much alive. Dr. Pierce kept this information to himself for the moment. He wanted to be sure. He ran more tests over the next 12 hours, consulting with neurologists, reviewing scans, confirming his findings. And every test came back the same. Margaret was conscious. Trapped, but conscious. And during those 12 hours, as Margaret lay in that bed, unable to move, unable to scream, she heard everything. She heard Richard on the phone in the hallway, talking to Elaine in a voice that was lighter than she had heard in years. She heard him laugh. She heard him say, "It's almost over." She heard Elaine respond, "Finally." And in that moment, Margaret understood. She understood that the man she had loved, the man she had sacrificed everything for, was not mourning her. He was celebrating. He was waiting for her to die so he could be free. And the woman he wanted to be free with was Elaine. The pain Margaret felt in that moment was worse than any physical pain. It was the pain of betrayal, of realizing that the life she thought she had built was a lie. But that pain didn't break her. It sharpened her. It cleared her mind. And she made a decision. If she survived this, if she ever regained control of her body, she would not waste a single second on people who had already buried her in their hearts. Margaret was declared clinically dead the next morning. The official paperwork was filed. Richard signed the death certificate without hesitation. Funeral arrangements began immediately. Richard chose a modest service, nothing too extravagant. He said Margaret would have wanted it that way. He called friends and family, delivering the news in a voice that sounded appropriately somber. He accepted condolences with grace, thanking people for their kind words, telling them that Margaret had been a wonderful woman, a devoted wife, a tireless worker. And people believed him. Because why wouldn't they? Richard had always been so convincing. Elaine played her part too. She stayed in the background at first, offering quiet support, being discreet. But as the days passed, she became more visible. She helped Richard choose the casket. She selected the flowers. She coordinated with the funeral home. And when people asked who she was, Richard introduced her as his executive assistant, someone who had been kind enough to help him through this difficult time. No one questioned it. No one suspected anything. Because grief makes people uncomfortable, and uncomfortable people don't ask hard questions. Richard wore black to the memorial, but his grief never reached his eyes. He delivered a eulogy that was beautifully written, full of touching anecdotes and poetic language. He spoke of Margaret's strength, her generosity, her unwavering dedication. He said she was the foundation of everything he had built, the silent force behind his success. He said he would miss her every day for the rest of his life. And as he spoke, he looked out at the crowd, at the faces filled with sympathy and sorrow, and he felt nothing but relief. Because in his mind, Margaret was gone. The obstacle was removed. And his future with Elaine could finally begin. Elaine wore black too, sitting in the third row, her hands folded in her lap, her face arranged in an expression of respectful sadness. But every now and then, when she thought no one was looking, her lips would twitch into the smallest hint of a smile. Because she had one. She had taken the man she wanted from the woman who had him. And now that woman was gone. Elaine didn't feel guilty. She felt victorious. She had spent 3 years playing the role of the dutiful assistant, 3 years waiting, 3 years being patient. And now, finally, she would get everything she had been promised. But in a quiet ICU room, machines kept humming. Dr. Pierce had kept Margaret on life support despite the official declaration. He hadn't told Richard. He hadn't told anyone except a small team of trusted colleagues. Because he knew what he had found, and he knew what it meant. Margaret was not dead. She was locked inside her body, aware, listening, learning. And Dr. Pierce believed she deserved a chance. He believed that if there was even the smallest possibility of recovery, they had to try. So he kept her alive, monitoring her brain activity, running tests, searching for any sign of improvement. And Margaret, trapped in the darkness of her own body, heard everything. She heard Richard on the phone, discussing the sale of the company. She heard him talking to lawyers about transferring assets, about liquidating accounts, about restructuring ownership. She heard Elaine's voice too, closer than it should have been, more familiar than it had any right to be. She heard them planning a future together, a future built on the grave of the woman who had made it all possible. And with every word, Margaret's resolve grew stronger. She focused every ounce of her consciousness on one goal, survival. She refused to let them win. She refused to let her story end like this. Days passed. Richard finalized the funeral arrangements. He met with Margaret's family, accepting their tears and their thanks. He told them Margaret had been at peace in her final moments, that she hadn't suffered. He lied so smoothly, so convincingly, that even Margaret's own mother believed him. The memorial was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon. Richard chose a small chapel, nothing too grand. He said Margaret would have appreciated the simplicity. He ordered white lilies, Margaret's favorite flower, and arranged for a closed casket. He didn't want anyone to see the body. He said it would be too painful, too difficult. And no one argued. But Dr. Pierce was growing more confident. Margaret's brain activity was increasing. Her responses to stimuli were becoming more consistent. He began to believe that she might actually wake up. He consulted with a neurologist who specialized in locked-in syndrome, and together they developed a treatment plan. They adjusted her medication, monitored her closely, and waited. And 3 days before the memorial, Margaret's right index finger twitched. It was barely noticeable, just a tiny movement, but it was intentional. Dr. Pierce had asked her to try to move her finger if she could hear him. And she did. She moved her finger. It was the first sign that she might be coming back. Dr. Pierce worked around the clock over the next 72 hours. He and his team tried everything they could think of to bring Margaret further out of the locked-in state. They used electrical stimulation, physical therapy, medication adjustments, anything that might help her regain control of her body. And slowly, agonizingly slowly, Margaret began to respond. First her fingers. Then her toes. Then her eyelids. By Friday night, less than 24 hours before the scheduled memorial, Margaret could open her eyes. She still couldn't speak. She still couldn't move most of her body. But she could see. And she could blink. And that was enough. Dr. Pierce made a decision. He would not let this memorial proceed. He would not let Richard and Elaine bury a woman who was still alive. He contacted the funeral home and told them the service needed to be postponed. They were confused, asked for an explanation. He told them there had been a medical development, that the deceased was not actually deceased. They thought he was joking. He assured them he was not. He told them to stop everything, to inform the family, to cancel the service immediately. But they hesitated. They said they couldn't just cancel a memorial without proper authorization. They said they needed to speak to the next of kin. So Dr. Pierce called Richard. Richard was at home, getting dressed for the memorial. He answered the phone impatiently, annoyed at the interruption. Dr. Pierce introduced himself, explained that he had been Margaret's attending physician. Richard interrupted him, said he was aware of who he was, asked what he wanted. Dr. Pierce took a breath and said, "Mr. Hale, your wife is alive." There was a long silence. Then Richard laughed. He said that wasn't possible, that Margaret had been declared dead, that the paperwork had been filed. Dr. Pierce said the paperwork was wrong. He explained locked-in syndrome, explained what had happened, explained that Margaret was awake and aware and very much alive. Richard's laughter stopped. His voice turned cold. He asked if Dr. Pierce was certain. Dr. Pierce said he was absolutely certain. Richard asked if Margaret could speak. Dr. Pierce said not yet, but she was making progress. Richard asked if she could move. Dr. Pierce said limited movement, but improving. Richard was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "I see." Dr. Pierce told him the memorial needed to be cancelled, that he needed to come to the hospital immediately. Richard said he would be there. Then he hung up. Richard stood in his bedroom, staring at his phone. Elaine was in the bathroom, putting on her makeup. She called out, asking who had been on the phone. Richard didn't answer. He was thinking. Calculating. Trying to figure out what this meant, what he should do, how he should respond. Elaine emerged from the bathroom, dressed in black, her hair pulled back, her makeup subtle and tasteful. She looked at Richard and frowned. She asked if something was wrong. Richard looked at her and said, "Margaret's alive." Elaine's face went pale. She asked what he meant. Richard explained what the doctor had said. Elaine sank onto the edge of the bed, her hands shaking. She asked if Margaret could talk. Richard said no. She asked if Margaret knew about them. Richard said he didn't know. Elaine looked up at him, her eyes wide with panic. She asked what they were going to do. Richard didn't answer. Because he didn't know. For the first time in years, Richard Hale had no plan, no strategy, no charming words to smooth things over. He was trapped. And he knew it. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment with, "I'm still here." Let's see who's truly following this shocking story. The morning of the memorial arrived. Richard and Elaine drove to the chapel in silence. Elaine kept glancing at Richard, trying to read his expression, but his face was blank. When they arrived, people were already gathering. Friends, colleagues, family members. Everyone dressed in black, everyone speaking in hushed tones. Margaret's mother was there, her eyes red from crying. Margaret's sister was there too, holding her mother's hand, trying to be strong. They saw Richard and approached him, embracing him, telling him how sorry they were. Richard accepted their condolences with practiced grace, his voice steady, his expression appropriately somber. But inside, Richard was calculating. He had decided not to say anything. Not yet. He would let the memorial proceed as planned, and then afterward, he would figure out how to handle the situation with Margaret. Maybe she wouldn't remember. Maybe the trauma had damaged her memory. Maybe she didn't know about Elaine. Maybe he could still salvage this. It was a long shot, but it was all he had. So he stood at the front of the chapel, greeting guests, shaking hands, accepting sympathy. And Elaine stood beside him, playing her role, offering quiet support, pretending to grieve for a woman she had wanted gone. The chapel filled up. Over 100 people came to pay their respects. Colleagues from the company, clients Richard had worked with, friends Margaret had known for years. They took their seats, the room falling into a heavy silence. Soft music played in the background. The closed casket sat at the front, draped in white lilies. Everything was ready. Everything was perfect. Richard took his place at the podium, ready to deliver his eulogy. He glanced at Elaine, who gave him a small, encouraging nod. He cleared his throat, opened his mouth to speak. And then the doors at the back of the chapel opened. Everyone turned. Dr. Pierce walked in, his face serious, his movements deliberate. He strode down the aisle, his footsteps echoing in the silent room. Richard's face went pale. He gripped the edges of the podium, his knuckles turning white. Dr. Pierce reached the front and looked directly at Richard. Then he turned to face the crowd. His voice was loud, clear, and unwavering. "This service is cancelled." Gasps filled the hall. People looked at each other in confusion. Margaret's mother stood up, her voice shaking. "What do you mean? What's going on?" Dr. Pierce looked at her with compassion. "Mrs. Whitman, your daughter is alive." The room erupted. People started talking all at once, their voices overlapping, their confusion turning to shock. Richard tried to speak, tried to regain control, but no one was listening to him. Dr. Pierce raised his hand, calling for silence. He explained, briefly and clearly, what had happened. He explained locked-in syndrome, explained the tests, explained that Margaret had been conscious the entire time. Margaret's mother collapsed into her seat, sobbing. Her sister stood frozen, unable to process what she was hearing. And then Dr. Pierce said, "She's here." The doors opened again. And Margaret was wheeled in. She was in a wheelchair, a nurse pushing her slowly down the aisle. She was pale, painfully thin, her hair limp, her body frail. But her eyes were open. And they were sharp. Clear. Aware. She looked around the room, taking in the faces of the people who had come to mourn her. She saw her mother, her sister, her friends. She saw the white lilies. She saw the closed casket that was meant to hold her body. And then she saw Richard. He stood at the podium, frozen, his face drained of color. Their eyes met. And for a moment, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. Margaret's lips moved. No sound came out, but Richard understood. He understood that she knew. He understood that she had heard everything. He understood that his carefully constructed lies were about to crumble. The nurse wheeled Margaret to the front of the chapel. Margaret's mother rushed to her, falling to her knees beside the wheelchair, gripping her daughter's hand, sobbing uncontrollably. Margaret couldn't speak, but she squeezed her mother's hand. It was weak, but it was there. Then Margaret turned her gaze to Elaine. Elaine was sitting in the third row, her face pale, her hands trembling. She looked like she wanted to disappear. Margaret stared at her for a long moment. Then she turned back to Richard. Dr. Pierce stepped forward and said, "Mrs. Hale cannot speak yet, but she has asked me to read a statement on her behalf." He pulled out a piece of paper. Margaret had communicated with him through blinking, slowly, painfully, spelling out words letter by letter. It had taken hours, but she had made sure every word was exactly what she wanted to say. Dr. Pierce began to read. "To everyone gathered here today, thank you for coming. Thank you for caring. But this memorial is not necessary, because I am still here. I am alive. And I have been alive this entire time. I heard everything. I saw everything. I know everything." The room was silent. People were staring, riveted, horrified. Dr. Pierce continued. "For 32 years, I gave everything to the man standing at that podium. I gave him my savings, my time, my energy, my love. I built a company with my own hands so that he could have the life he dreamed of. And in return, he gave me betrayal." Richard tried to speak. "Margaret, please, let me explain." Dr. Pierce held up a hand. "She's not finished." He continued reading. "I know about Elaine. I know about the affair. I know that while I was lying in a hospital bed, fighting for my life, you were planning your future with her. I know that you signed my death certificate without hesitation. I know that you felt relief when you thought I was gone. And I know that you were ready to erase me from your life as if I had never existed." People in the audience were crying now. Some were shaking their heads in disbelief. Others were staring at Richard with open disgust. Elaine stood up, trying to leave, but someone blocked her path. She sank back into her seat, her face buried in her hands. Dr. Pierce kept reading. "But here is what you don't know, Richard. 6 months ago, I suspected something was wrong. I felt the distance between us. I saw the way you looked at her. And I prepared. I transferred ownership of Hale Enterprises into a trust under my name. I documented every financial transaction. I secured everything I built. Because I loved you, Richard, but I'm not a fool. Richard's face crumbled. He looked like he might collapse. Margaret's sister stood up and shouted, "Get out. Both of you, get out." She was pointing at Richard and Elaine. Other people started standing too, their voices rising, their anger palpable. Richard looked around the room, seeing the faces of people who had once respected him now filled with contempt. He tried to speak, tried to defend himself, but no words came. Because there was nothing he could say. Nothing that would undo what he had done. Dr. Pierce finished the statement. "I am alive. I will recover. And I will move forward. But I will do so without you, Richard. You buried yourself long before you ever tried to bury me. And to everyone else, thank you for your love and support. I will need it in the days ahead. But today is not a day of mourning. Today is a day of truth." Dr. Pierce folded the paper and stepped back. The chapel was silent except for the sound of people crying. Margaret sat in her wheelchair, her eyes still on Richard. She couldn't smile. Her muscles wouldn't allow it yet. But there was something in her expression. Something that looked like peace. Richard turned and walked out of the chapel. Elaine followed him, her head down, her shoulders shaking. They left together, but they didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. Outside, the sky was gray and overcast. Richard stood on the steps of the chapel, staring at nothing. Elaine stood a few feet away, crying quietly. They had lost. They had lost everything. And they both knew it. Inside the chapel, Margaret was surrounded by her family and friends. People were hugging her, crying, telling her how glad they were that she was alive. Margaret couldn't respond with words, but her eyes spoke volumes. She was tired. She was hurt. But she was here. And she had won. Over the next few weeks, Margaret's recovery continued. Dr. Pierce and his team worked tirelessly to help her regain control of her body. It was slow, frustrating work. Every movement required immense effort. But Margaret was determined. She practiced every day, pushing through the pain, refusing to give up. And gradually, she improved. She regained movement in her hands, then her arms, then her legs. She learned to sit up, to stand, to take small, shaky steps. And finally, 6 weeks after she woke up, she spoke her first words. Her voice was hoarse, barely a whisper, but it was hers. She looked at Dr. Pierce and said, "Thank you." Dr. Pierce smiled. "You did this, Margaret. You fought for this." Margaret shook her head slightly. "You gave me the chance. That's everything." Over the following months, Margaret continued to recover. She underwent physical therapy, speech therapy, and counseling. The trauma of what she had experienced, both physical and emotional, had left deep scars. But she was healing. Slowly, painfully, but steadily. She returned to her family, to her friends, to the life she had almost lost. But it was a different life now. She was different now. Richard, on the other hand, fell apart. The story of what he had done spread quickly. It was impossible to contain. People at the company found out. Clients found out. The media found out. Within days, Richard's name was synonymous with betrayal and greed. The company that Margaret had built, that Richard had claimed as his own, wanted nothing to do with him. The board of directors held an emergency meeting and voted unanimously to remove him from all positions of authority. His name was stripped from the company letterhead. His office was cleared out. And because Margaret had transferred ownership months earlier, he had no legal recourse. He was simply removed. Clients began canceling contracts. Business partners distanced themselves. Friends stopped returning his calls. Richard's reputation, the thing he had valued above all else, was destroyed. He tried to salvage it, tried to tell his side of the story, tried to explain that it wasn't what it looked like. But no one wanted to hear it. Because it was exactly what it looked like. He had betrayed his wife, the woman who had sacrificed everything for him, and he had celebrated her supposed death. There was no explaining that away. No amount of charm or smooth talking could fix what he had broken. Elaine disappeared. She left town without a word, deleting her social media accounts, cutting off all contact. Richard tried to reach her, but she never responded. Because Elaine had only been interested in Richard when he had power, when he had status, when he had something to offer. Now that he had nothing, she had no use for him. Richard was left alone, living in a small apartment, working odd jobs to pay his bills. Everything he had built, everything he had taken credit for, was gone. And he had no one to blame but himself. Margaret, meanwhile, was rebuilding. She moved into a smaller house, something comfortable and quiet. She reconnected with old friends, people she had lost touch with during the years she had spent working non-stop. She traveled, something she had never allowed herself to do before. She went to places she had always dreamed of seeing, Italy, Greece, Japan. She took her time, soaked in the beauty, allowed herself to simply exist without the weight of responsibility crushing her. And slowly, she began to smile again. Not the tired, strained smile she had worn for years, but a real, genuine smile. She also returned to work, but on her own terms. She resumed control of Hale Enterprises, but she restructured it completely. She changed the name to Whitman Group, using her maiden name. She brought in new leadership, people she trusted, people who shared her values. She shifted the company's focus, prioritizing ethical practices, employee well-being, and long-term sustainability over short-term profits. And under her leadership, the company thrived. Clients respected her. Employees admired her. And Margaret, for the first time in her life, felt proud of what she had built. But the emotional scars remained. Margaret struggled with trust. She found it hard to let people close, hard to believe that anyone truly cared about her rather than what she could provide. She attended therapy regularly, working through the trauma, trying to make sense of what had happened to her. Her therapist told her that betrayal of that magnitude often leaves people feeling broken, feeling like they can't trust their own judgment. But Margaret refused to let it define her. She had survived. She had fought her way back from the edge of death. And she would not let Richard take anything else from her. One afternoon, about 8 months after the memorial, Margaret was sitting in her office when she received an unexpected visitor. Her assistant buzzed her, sounding uncertain. "Mrs. Hale, there's someone here to see you. He says his name is Richard Hale." Margaret felt her chest tighten. She hadn't seen Richard since that day in the chapel. She had heard about his downfall, heard that he had lost everything, but she had deliberately kept her distance. She took a deep breath and told her assistant to send him in. She wanted to face him. She needed to see the man who had tried to erase her, to look him in the eyes one more time. Richard walked into her office looking like a shadow of his former self. His suit was wrinkled and outdated. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow. He had aged 10 years in 8 months. He stood in the doorway, hesitant, as if unsure whether he was allowed to enter. Margaret gestured to the chair across from her desk. "Sit down, Richard." He sat, his hands folded in his lap, his gaze fixed on the floor. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched between them, heavy with everything that had been broken. Finally, Richard spoke. His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. "I don't expect you to forgive me." Margaret said nothing. She just watched him, waiting. Richard continued, "I know what I did. I know how badly I hurt you. And I know there's no excuse for it. I was selfish. I was weak. I convinced myself that I deserved more than what I had, and I didn't care who I hurt to get it. He finally looked up at her, and Margaret saw something in his eyes she had never seen before. Genuine remorse. Real pain. He wasn't performing anymore. He wasn't trying to manipulate her. He was simply broken. "I lost everything, Margaret," Richard said, his voice cracking. "The company, my reputation, my friends. Even Elaine. She left the moment I had nothing left to give her. And I deserve it. I deserve all of it. But the worst part, the part that keeps me awake at night, is knowing what I did to you. You gave me everything. You believed in me when no one else did. You sacrificed your dreams so I could chase mine. And I repaid you with betrayal. I celebrated your death. I stood over your hospital bed and felt relief. What kind of monster does that?" Margaret let him speak. She didn't interrupt. She didn't offer comfort. She simply listened. Richard wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "I came here to tell you that I'm sorry. I know it doesn't change anything. I know it doesn't fix what I broke. But I needed you to hear it. I needed you to know that I understand what I did, and that I will carry the weight of it for the rest of my life. You deserved so much better than me, Margaret. You always did." He stood up, preparing to leave. Margaret spoke for the first time since he had entered. "Richard." He stopped, turned back to her. Margaret's voice was calm, measured. "You're right. I did deserve better. I deserved a partner who valued me, who respected me, who loved me the way I loved him. But I didn't get that. I got you. And for a long time, I blamed myself. I thought maybe I hadn't been enough. Maybe I had worked too hard, focused too much on the business, neglected you somehow. But I've had a lot of time to think, and I've realized something. Your betrayal wasn't about me. It was about you. It was about your insecurity, your greed, your need for validation. You took credit for my work because deep down, you didn't believe you could succeed on your own. You turned to Elaine because she made you feel like the man you wanted to be rather than the man you actually were." Richard's face crumbled. He looked like he wanted to argue, but he couldn't. Because everything Margaret was saying was true. She continued, "I don't forgive you, Richard. I may never forgive you. But I don't hate you either. Hating you would give you power over me, and I refuse to give you any more of my life than you've already taken. So I'm letting you go. Not for your sake, but for mine. I'm choosing to move forward without carrying the weight of what you did. And I hope, for your sake, that you find a way to live with yourself. Because I don't envy the person you've become." Richard stood there, tears streaming down his face. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. Finally, he nodded, turned, and walked out of her office. Margaret watched him go, and as the door closed behind him, she felt something release in her chest. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't closure, not entirely. But it was freedom. Freedom from the need for his approval, his love, his validation. She had spent 32 years defining herself by her relationship with him, by what she could give him, by how she could support him. But she wasn't that person anymore. She was Margaret Whitman. And she belonged to herself. Life continued. Margaret threw herself into her work, but this time, it was different. She wasn't working out of obligation or desperation. She was working because she loved what she did, because she believed in the company she had built, because she wanted to create something that would outlast her. She also began mentoring young women in business, sharing her story, teaching them the lessons she had learned the hard way. She spoke at conferences, wrote articles, and became a voice for women who had been overlooked, undervalued, and betrayed. Her story resonated with thousands of people. She received letters from women all over the country, thanking her for her courage, for her strength, for showing them that survival was possible. One woman wrote, "I was ready to give up. My husband left me for someone younger, and I felt like my life was over. But then I heard your story, and I realized that my life wasn't over. It was just beginning. Thank you for reminding me that I'm worth more than what someone else thinks of me. Margaret kept that letter in her desk drawer. She read it whenever she felt tired, whenever the weight of everything threatened to pull her down. It reminded her why she kept going, why she kept sharing her story, why she refused to let her pain be meaningless. Margaret also reconnected with her sister, Emily. They had always been close as children, but as Margaret poured herself into the business, they had drifted apart. Emily had tried to stay in touch, had invited Margaret to family gatherings, had called and texted, but Margaret had always been too busy, too focused, too consumed by work. But now, with everything that had happened, Margaret realized how much she had missed. She had missed birthdays, holidays, moments that could never be reclaimed. So she made a conscious decision to prioritize the people who truly mattered. She and Emily began meeting for lunch every week. They talked about everything, their childhood, their parents, their regrets, their hopes. Emily told Margaret how worried she had been all those years, how she had watched her sister disappear into her work, how she had tried to warn her about Richard but hadn't known how. Margaret listened, and for the first time, she didn't feel defensive. She didn't make excuses. She simply acknowledged that Emily had been right. Emily held her hand across the table and said, "I'm just glad you're still here. I'm glad I get to have my sister back." Margaret squeezed her hand and said, "Me too." Margaret also spent time with her mother. Her mother was in her 70s now, still sharp but slowing down. They would sit together in the garden of Margaret's new house, drinking tea, watching the birds, talking about life. Her mother told her stories about her father, about the early years of their marriage, about the struggles they had faced. She told Margaret that marriage was work, that it required effort and compromise and patience. But she also said, it should never require you to lose yourself. Your father and I built a life together, but we were always still ourselves. He never asked me to be smaller so he could be bigger. And I never asked that of him either. Margaret thought about that a lot. She thought about how she had made herself smaller for Richard, how she had dimmed her own light so his could shine brighter. She thought about all the times she had bitten her tongue, swallowed her pride, accepted less than she deserved. And she made a promise to herself that she would never do that again. If she ever allowed someone into her life again, it would be someone who celebrated her, not someone who needed her to shrink. Her mother looked at her one afternoon and said, "You're different now. Stronger. I can see it in your eyes." Margaret smiled and said, "I survived something I never thought I would." That changes you. About a year after the memorial, Margaret received an invitation to speak at a women's leadership conference in New York. The theme was, Rising from the Ashes, Stories of Resilience and Reinvention. Margaret accepted. She flew to New York, checked into her hotel, and spent the evening preparing her speech. She wanted to get it right. She wanted to honor the woman she had been, the woman who had given everything, and the woman she had become, the woman who had learned to take it back. The next morning, she stood on a stage in front of 500 women and told her story. She told them about building a company from nothing. She told them about sacrificing her dreams for someone else's ambition. She told them about betrayal, about lying in a hospital bed and hearing the people she loved celebrate her death. She told them about locked-in syndrome, about being trapped in her own body, about the terror and the helplessness and the rage. And she told them about survival. About fighting her way back. About reclaiming her life. About learning that her worth was not determined by what she could give to others, but by what she believed about herself. When she finished, the room was silent. Then one woman stood up and started clapping. Then another. Then another. Within seconds, the entire room was on its feet, applauding, some women crying, others cheering. Margaret stood on that stage, looking out at the faces of women who understood, who had experienced their own betrayals, their own losses, their own resurrections. And she felt something she hadn't felt in years. She felt proud. Not proud of what she had endured, but proud of how she had endured it. proud of the fact that she was still standing. After the conference, several women approached her, wanting to share their own stories. One woman told her about leaving an abusive marriage. Another told her about being pushed out of a company she had helped build. Another told her about losing everything in a business partnership gone wrong. And Margaret listened to each of them, offered encouragement, reminded them that survival was not just about making it through, it was about deciding who you wanted to be on the other side. She gave them her contact information, told them to reach out if they ever needed support. And many of them did. Margaret began building a network of women who had been through similar experiences. They called it the Phoenix Collective, a name that symbolized rising from the ashes. They met quarterly, sharing stories, offering advice, supporting each other through the hard days. Margaret found that helping others was healing her too. It gave her purpose beyond her work, beyond her own recovery. It reminded her that pain could be transformed into power, that wounds could become wisdom, that survival could become service. 2 years after the memorial, Margaret met someone. His name was David, and he was a professor of philosophy at a local university. They met at a charity event, found themselves seated next to each other at dinner, and ended up talking for hours. David was kind, thoughtful, and genuinely interested in what Margaret had to say. He didn't know who she was, didn't know her story, didn't treat her like she was fragile or damaged. He treated her like she was fascinating. They exchanged numbers, started meeting for coffee, then dinners, then long walks through the park. Margaret was hesitant at first. The idea of trusting someone again, of opening her heart again, terrified her. But David was patient. He never pushed. He let her set the pace. And slowly, carefully, Margaret allowed herself to feel again. She told David her story one evening, sitting on a bench overlooking the river. She told him everything: Richard, Elaine, the betrayal, the hospital, the memorial. She watched his face as she spoke, trying to gauge his reaction. When she finished, David was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Thank you for trusting me with that." He didn't pity her. He didn't try to fix her. He just acknowledged her strength. "What you went through would have destroyed most people," David said. "But you didn't just survive it. You transformed it. You built something meaningful from the wreckage. That takes incredible courage." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. She hadn't realized how much she needed to hear that, needed someone to see her not as a victim but as a warrior. David reached over and took her hand. "I can't promise I'll never hurt you, Margaret. I'm human, and humans make mistakes. But I can promise that I will never take you for granted. I will never diminish you to make myself feel bigger. And I will never celebrate your pain." Margaret squeezed his hand and said, "That's all I need." Their relationship grew slowly, built on honesty and mutual respect. David introduced her to his world, philosophy, literature, ideas that challenged her thinking and expanded her perspective. Margaret introduced him to hers, business, strategy, the satisfaction of building something tangible and lasting. They learned from each other, supported each other, and most importantly, they allowed each other to be fully themselves. Margaret found that she could be vulnerable with David without feeling weak, that she could share her fears without being judged, that she could be strong without being seen as intimidating. 3 years after the memorial, Margaret stood in front of a mirror in her bedroom, adjusting the collar of her dress. She was preparing for an event, the annual gala for Whitman Group, celebrating the company's continued success and its commitment to ethical business practices. She looked at herself in the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. She looked healthy, vibrant, alive. Her eyes, once dull with exhaustion and sadness, now sparkled with purpose and joy. She had gained back the weight she had lost during her illness. Her hair was styled elegantly. She looked like someone who had not just survived, but thrived. David appeared in the doorway, dressed in a tuxedo, looking handsome and confident. "You ready?" he asked. Margaret smiled. "Almost." She turned back to the mirror, taking one last look. She thought about the woman she had been 3 years ago, lying in a hospital bed, trapped in her own body, listening to her husband celebrate her death. That woman had been broken, devastated, hopeless. But she had also been strong. Strong enough to fight. Strong enough to survive. Strong enough to rebuild. And the woman standing in the mirror now was the proof of that strength. Margaret turned to David and took his hand. "I'm ready." They walked out of the house together, drove to the venue, and stepped into a room filled with people who respected her, admired her, and celebrated her. Margaret moved through the crowd, greeting guests, thanking them for their support, accepting compliments with grace. She gave a speech that night, thanking her team, acknowledging the challenges they had overcome, and outlining the company's vision for the future. And as she spoke, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. This was her life now. A life she had built on her own terms. A life that belonged to no one but herself. Later that night, as the event wound down, Margaret stepped outside onto a balcony overlooking the city. The night air was cool, the city lights twinkling below like stars. David joined her, handing her a glass of champagne. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the world move below them. David said, "You've come a long way." Margaret smiled. "I have." David asked, "Do you ever think about him? About Richard?" Margaret considered the question. "Sometimes. But not the way I used to. I don't think about what we had or what I lost. I think about what I learned. I learned that loyalty means nothing if it's not reciprocated. I learned that love should lift you up, not tear you down. And I learned that survival is not just about staying alive. It's about deciding what kind of life is worth living." David nodded. "And what kind of life is that?" Margaret looked at him, her eyes shining. "One where I'm not afraid to take up space. One where I'm not shrinking myself for anyone. One where I'm surrounded by people who see me, really see me, and value me for who I am, not what I can do for them." David raised his glass. "To that life." Margaret clinked her glass against his. "To that life." They drank, and as Margaret looked out over the city, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. She felt whole. The years continued to pass, and Margaret's life continued to flourish. Whitman Group expanded, opening offices in new cities, taking on larger clients, making a real impact in the business world. Margaret's reputation grew, not as the woman betrayed by her husband, but as a leader, an innovator, a force to be reckoned with. She was invited to sit on boards, to advise startups, to mentor the next generation of entrepreneurs. And she did all of it with the same quiet determination that had carried her through the darkest days of her life. She also continued her work with the Phoenix Collective, which had grown from a small group of women meeting quarterly to a national organization with chapters in multiple states. They offered support groups, legal resources, financial planning assistance, and mentorship programs for women recovering from betrayal, abuse, and loss. Margaret was proud of what they had built, proud of the lives they had changed, proud of the community they had created. She received letters and emails regularly from women thanking her for giving them hope, for showing them that life after devastation was not just possible, but beautiful. One letter, in particular, stayed with her. It was from a woman named Sarah who had lost her business, her marriage, and nearly her life after discovering her husband had embezzled money from their company and framed her for it. Sarah wrote, "I was ready to give up. I didn't see the point in fighting anymore. But then I heard you speak, and something inside me shifted. You said that survival is a choice, and that we get to decide what our story becomes. So I chose to fight. I cleared my name, rebuilt my business, and left my husband. And now, 3 years later, I'm thriving. I have a life I love, filled with people who genuinely care about me. Thank you for reminding me that I was worth fighting for." Margaret kept that letter in her office, alongside dozens of others. On hard days, when the weight of leadership felt heavy, when she questioned whether she was making a difference, she would read those letters. And they would remind her why she kept going. Because her story wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every woman who had been betrayed, dismissed, undervalued, and overlooked. It was about proving that survival was possible, that reinvention was real, that life could be better on the other side of devastation. 5 years after the memorial, Margaret received an unexpected email. It was from Elaine. Margaret stared at the name in her inbox for a long time before opening it. She hadn't heard from Elaine since that day in the chapel, hadn't thought about her much either. But curiosity got the better of her, and she clicked on the email. It was short, just a few paragraphs. Elaine wrote that she had seen an article about Margaret, about her success, about the Phoenix Collective. She wrote that she had been living in another state, working under a different name, trying to outrun the shame of what she had done. She wrote that she was in therapy now, trying to understand why she had done what she did, trying to make peace with the person she had been. Elaine didn't ask for forgiveness. She didn't make excuses. She simply said, "I know I don't deserve your time or your grace, but I wanted you to know that I understand now what I took from you. I understand the pain I caused. And I will spend the rest of my life trying to be a better person than I was then. You didn't deserve what we did to you. And I'm sorry." Margaret read the email 3 times. She felt no anger, no bitterness, no need for revenge. She felt nothing, really. Just a distant acknowledgement that Elaine was another broken person trying to find her way. Margaret didn't respond to the email. She didn't block Elaine either. She simply archived it and moved on. Because Elaine's guilt was Elaine's burden to carry, not hers. Margaret's relationship with David deepened over the years. They moved in together, blending their lives in a way that felt natural and easy. David respected Margaret's independence, never tried to control her or dim her light. And Margaret learned to trust again, learned to lean on someone without losing herself. They talked about marriage once, sitting on the couch one evening, sharing a bottle of wine. David said he would marry her in a heartbeat if that's what she wanted. Margaret thought about it, really thought about it. And she realized that marriage, the institution itself, didn't matter to her anymore. What mattered was the partnership, the respect, the love. And she already had all of that. She told David, "I don't need a ceremony or a piece of paper to know that you're my partner. I don't need a legal contract to prove that we're committed. What we have is enough." David smiled. "Then that's what we'll have." And they did. They built a life together without the formalities, without the expectations, without the need for external validation. They traveled together, exploring new places, creating new memories. They supported each other's work, celebrated each other's successes, and comforted each other through setbacks. They laughed together, cried together, and built a relationship based on equality and mutual respect. Margaret also reconnected with parts of herself she had buried for years. She started painting again, something she had loved as a young woman but had given up when life got too busy. She set up a small studio in her house, filled it with canvases and paints and brushes, and spent hours there, creating art that expressed the emotions she couldn't always put into words. Her paintings were raw, visceral, beautiful in their honesty. David encouraged her to show them, to share them with the world, but Margaret resisted at first. These paintings were hers, her way of processing, her way of healing. But eventually, she agreed to show a few pieces at a local gallery. The response was overwhelming. People connected with her work, saw their own pain and triumph reflected in her brushstrokes. One painting, titled "Awakening," depicted a woman emerging from darkness, her body fragmented but her eyes sharp and aware. It sold within hours of the gallery opening. Another painting, titled "Phoenix," showed a woman standing in flames, not being consumed by them, but transformed by them. That one, Margaret kept for herself. It hung in her office, a constant reminder of what she had survived and who she had become. As the years passed, Margaret thought less and less about Richard. She heard updates occasionally, through mutual acquaintances or news articles. He was working as a consultant now, helping small businesses with their operations. He had remarried, a woman he had met at a support group for people dealing with public disgrace. Margaret felt nothing when she heard the news. No jealousy, no anger, no satisfaction. Just indifference. Richard was a chapter in her life that had closed, and she had no interest in reopening it. But she did think about the woman she had been, the woman who had given everything without asking for anything in return. She thought about how that woman had believed that love meant sacrifice, that loyalty meant endurance, that strength meant silence. And she wished she could go back and tell that woman the truth. That love should be reciprocal. That loyalty should be mutual. That strength sometimes means walking away. But she couldn't go back. All she could do was move forward, and help other women avoid the mistakes she had made. Margaret turned 60, a milestone she celebrated with a small gathering of the people who mattered most. Her mother was there, older and frilier but still sharp, still proud of her daughter. Her sister Emily was there, along with her husband and children. David was there, of course, by her side as always. And several women from the Phoenix Collective were there too, women Margaret had mentored, women whose lives she had touched. They shared stories, laughter, and tears. They toasted to survival, to resilience, to the beauty of second chances. One woman, a young entrepreneur named Jasmine who Margaret had been mentoring for 2 years, stood up and gave a speech. "Margaret, you changed my life. When I met you, I was broken. My business partner had stolen everything from me, and I didn't think I would ever recover. But you showed me that recovery was possible. You showed me that I could build something new, something better. And you taught me that my worth is not determined by what others think of me, but by what I think of myself. So thank you. Thank you for being the example I needed. Thank you for proving that strong women lift each other up. And thank you for reminding all of us that our stories are not over until we say they are." Margaret felt tears stream down her face. She stood up and hugged Jasmine, holding her tightly. "Your strength is your own," Margaret whispered. "I just helped you see it." As the evening continued, Margaret looked around at the faces of the people who had gathered to celebrate her. These were her people. Her tribe. Her family, not by blood, but by choice. And she realized that this feeling of being surrounded by love and respect and genuine connection, this was what she had been searching for all along. Not success. Not recognition. Not validation. Just love. Real, honest, unconditional love. What would you have done in Margaret's place? Would you have confronted Richard the way she did, or would you have handled it differently? Do you think she should have responded to Elaine's email? And most importantly, what does this story teach you about trust, betrayal, and the power of survival? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your perspective. And if this story moved you, if it made you think, if it reminded you of your own strength, please subscribe to our channel. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our upcoming stories. Because we believe that every story has the power to change a life, including yours. Thank you for watching, and remember, your story is not over until you say it is. Margaret lived the rest of her life on her own terms. She continued to lead Whitman Group with wisdom and integrity. She continued to mentor women through the Phoenix Collective, watching with pride as they rebuilt their lives and reclaimed their power. She continued to paint, to travel, to love, to laugh. She lived fully, deeply, authentically. And when people asked her how she had survived what she had been through, how she had come back from the edge of death and betrayal, she always gave the same answer. "I survived because I decided I was worth surviving for. I survived because I refused to let the worst moment of my life define the rest of my life. And I survived because I learned that strength is not about never falling. It's about getting back up, dusting yourself off, and choosing to keep going even when everything inside you wants to give up. That's survival. That's resilience. And that's a choice we all have, every single day." Margaret Hale, the woman who was declared dead but refused to stay buried, lived to be 87 years old. She passed away peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by the people who loved her, in a home filled with art and light and laughter. Her funeral was attended by hundreds of people, women whose lives she had touched, whose stories she had changed, whose strength she had awakened. They didn't mourn her. They celebrated her. Because Margaret hadn't just lived. She had shown others how to live. And that legacy, that impact, that gift, lived on long after she was gone. And somewhere, in a small apartment across the country, Richard Hale sat alone, watching the news coverage of Margaret's death. He saw the tributes, heard the stories, read the articles about her extraordinary life. And he wept. Not for her. But for himself. For the life he could have had if he had been brave enough to love her the way she deserved. For the man he could have been if he hadn't been so consumed by his own insecurity and greed. Richard lived another 10 years, alone and forgotten, carrying the weight of his choices until the day he died. And when he died, there was no memorial. No tributes. No celebration. Just silence. Because some people leave a legacy. And some people leave a warning. Richard Hale was the latter. Margaret Whitman was the former. And the difference between them was simple: Margaret chose to build with her pain. Richard chose to hide from his. Margaret chose forgiveness, not for Richard, but for herself. Richard chose bitterness, and it consumed him. Margaret chose to live. Richard merely existed. And in the end, that choice made all the difference. This is the story of a woman who died and came back to life, not because of a miracle, but because of sheer will. This is the story of betrayal, survival, and the unbreakable strength of the human spirit. This is the story of Margaret Whitman, a woman who refused to let the worst moment of her life define her, who rebuilt herself from the ashes, and who showed the world that survival is not just about staying alive. It's about choosing to truly live. And that choice, that beautiful, courageous, life-affirming choice, is available to every single one of us, every single day. We just have to be brave enough to take it. Remember Margaret's story. Remember her strength. And remember that no matter what you've been through, no matter how broken you feel, no matter how impossible recovery seems, you have the power to rise. You have the power to rebuild. You have the power to choose a different ending. Because your story, like Margaret's, is not over until you say it is. So what will you choose? Will you let your pain define you? Or will you transform it into power? Will you stay buried? Or will you rise? The choice is yours. And it always has been. Thank you for staying with us through this entire journey. Thank you for witnessing Margaret's story. And thank you for being here, for being open, for being willing to reflect on your own life and your own choices. If this story touched you, if it challenged you, if it inspired you, please share it. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Share it with someone who's struggling. Share it with someone who needs to be reminded that survival is possible, that healing is real, and that life after devastation can be beautiful. Because stories like Margaret's have the power to change lives. And your life, your story, matters just as much. Never forget that.